It down front. Before I jump into today's material, I just want to bring our attention to the syllabus. Mostly I just want to point out our midterm exam is coming up in a couple of weeks. So now we're about 3 weeks out from our midterm exam. So again, something to keep your eye on because that is upcoming. Any questions on like upcoming schedule stuff before we jump into things? All right, cool. Going to the Canvas page for the course, I want to point out here, we're going to go through the week 6 slides, lecture 6 slides today within week 4. The Think, Pair, Share for the week, you're going to submit Wednesdays. I'll point out the second homework quiz is coming up this weekend. That's going to cover material from last week and this week. So all things to keep in mind. So jumping into today's lecture, we're going to talk about production costs, revenues, and profits today. So again, hopefully some review from your Principles of Microeconomics course. And we're going to start here with a production-related Think, Pair, Share. So 2 questions that you're going to work through. Number 1, suppose Nikola Jokic, arguably the best player in the NBA, were to leave the Denver Nuggets to join the Washington Wizards, arguably the worst team in the league. How many additional games do you think the Wizards would win? So that's question number 1. And then question number 2, now suppose that instead he were to decide to join the Thunder, who just won the championship. How many additional games do you think the Thunder would win? So 2 questions you're going to think through here. Again, take a minute or 2 on your own. I'll tell you when to go in the groups, and then we'll talk. You can just go right into groups at this point. Go ahead. All right, I'm going to bring us back together. All right, let's come back together as a group. Probably didn't need a ton of time for this one. Does somebody want to share what they said for number 1?
If Jokic was to join the Wizards, I think that we thought that the Wizards would win about 20 more games instead of 38.
Yeah, I think that sounds like a potentially reasonable answer. Someone want to share their answer to number 2 for contrast?
I think they probably win like 5 more games than less. Maybe even like you lose 2 less games. Because like they won what 67 and 15 or something like that. It's like how can't really even answer that.
Yeah, so regardless of what the number is, right? And again, I recognize not everybody follows the NBA, but kind of the point here is if the best player in the league goes and joins the worst team, they're going to win a lot more games, right? So Jokic leaves the Nuggets, joins the Wizards. Yeah, maybe they won twice as many games as they won last year or something, right? A really big impact. Alternatively, if he were to join the Thunder, I don't know, he's taking minutes away from Chet at that point, probably starting at, the 5, or maybe he's taking minutes away from the other big there. What's his name? Anyways, they're not going to win many more games, right? The Thunder won 68 games, 67 games, whatever, last year. They might win a couple more games. But the takeaway here, right, is if you keep adding talent, right? If you add talent to a team without much talent, you're going to see a big return, right? If you add talent to a team with a lot of talent already, you're not going to see as big of a return. Questions on this? Comments on this? Okay. So how does that tie into the stuff we're learning today? We'll get there, starting with a review question. In which of the following leagues do we see the least intra-season balance? So take 30 seconds to look through these choices. We're looking for the least balance among these choices. All right, hands for A, hands for B, hands for C, hands for D. Yeah, so should be A, least balance in choice A, right? In choice A, you've got, one team that's really, really good, another team that's really bad, a couple of teams somewhere in the middle, right? Compare that to choice D, right, where all 4 of these teams are relatively close in their records, right? Questions on this? And again, this is just a review from last week's stuff. Okay. So we're going to talk today about production, revenue, costs, and profits. So before we get into all of that, right, there is this question, if I were to ask any of you what the goal of a company is, you would probably say the company wants to make money, right? Again, that's not true for every company, right? But I think a pretty good starting place if we think about how firms are to behave or how companies make decisions, right? Starting with this assumption of wanting to make money is probably a good assumption. If we think about the sport setting specifically, you might have other goals. One of those goals might be winning, right? Some of these billionaire team owners might value winning over profits. But generally speaking, if you think about why does the team owner want to win, that probably drives up the franchise value, right? So maybe they're thinking longer term returns instead of shorter term returns. Okay. Maybe there are other objectives. There are nonprofit organizations that are not, trying to necessarily make money, right? There are organizations with varying objectives, but a pretty safe starting point is to assume that firms want to make money. Giving some more formal terminology to that goal of making money, firms want to make profits, where profits are revenues minus cost. Total revenue is a term we give to the money that's coming in, so how much money the firm is taking in from the sale of their products. Costs, that's how much money the firm is expending to produce the product, right? So revenue, money coming in from the sale of products, cost, the money going out to produce the products. And then profit is revenue minus cost, right? So profit is money coming in minus money coming out. That's what's left over. So again, we're going to implicitly assume that the goal of most firms is to maximize profits. Questions on this? And again, probably a pretty fair starting point. So before we get into costs explicitly, I want to talk about this idea of production. And we could formally define a production function which shows the relationship between what's going in to the production process, our inputs to production, and then what ends up coming out. So production function shows us the relationship between what's going in and what's going out. If you were taking like an advanced microeconomic course offered by the econ department, you might see a functional form for a production function. In a principles of micro course, you probably saw a table that illustrated a production function that showed, for various combinations of your inputs, your labor and capital and other things, how much is being produced. Marginal product is a term we give to the change in total output when we add an additional unit of some input. So maybe, if we add one more worker to the production process, how much more is produced when we add that worker? And in that case, if we're adding a worker to the production process, we call it marginal product of labor. So what is the additional output that comes from adding one more worker? Mathematically, marginal product is our change in output divided by our change in input. And again, we could talk about marginal product for any of our inputs. Often we focus on labor. And hopefully this is all a review from a principles of econ class. Questions so far? Something that we see happen in practice is this concept of diminishing marginal product, which is the property where as quantity of an input goes up, holding some other input fixed, eventually the marginal product of that input starts to fall. So for example, if we keep our production space fixed and we add more and more workers, eventually the next worker is going to add less to total output than the prior worker did. This is so common in practice that we call it the law of diminishing marginal product. Basically just states that as we add more and more of some input, holding other inputs fixed, eventually our output falls. Questions before I go through an example? Now, the example I like to give is, I usually talk about like the production process at like a Subway or a Chipotle. You know what I'm talking about when I'm talking about like a Chipotle? How many of you have not been to a Chipotle? Okay, right. So you go into Chipotle, right? You walk up in line. They've got whatever the device is where they, put the tortilla in to steam it. If you're getting a burrito, they've got their bowls. Sorry, this is lunchtime. You're all getting hungry again. I apologize. And then they've got the rice choices. You got your beans. You got your meats. Then you've got all the different toppings. Then you get to the end of the line. They put the burrito together or the bowl together. They got somebody cashing you out. Behind the production line, they've got their grills. They've got their rice cooker, right? They've got various counters where they're chopping up veggies and stuff, right? But you get the picture of what it looks like at Chipotle, right? So this concept of diminishing marginal product, right? Well, imagine that, you have this Chipotle location. You decide to start a Chipotle franchise. And you've got just one worker, right? So you've got one worker working the entire store. That worker is handling all the stuff in the back. The customer comes in. They're taking the order. They're putting the whole order together. They're then probably taking off their gloves, using the cash register to cash the person out, and then they go to the next person, right? They're handling everything. If you had a second worker to that production, and that one worker in a given hour might be able to make 20 burritos, let's say, right? So that one worker in that hour is making 20 burritos. What happens when you add a second worker to the process? Well, that second worker, there's probably some degree of specialization that happens, right? Where you've got one worker that now handles the production line. The other worker might handle making the food in the back, and then they also handle the cash register or something, right? And maybe with two workers in an hour, you're producing 50 burritos, right? The marginal product of that second worker, the first worker is able to make 20, the second adds 30 to the process. So initially marginal product might go up, right? And maybe the same thing happens when you add a third worker, right? Now you've got 3 workers, maybe you've got one person who's handling the stuff in the back, one person who starts the order, does, burrito or bowl, tortilla, rice, beans, meat. The other person handles the rest of the toppings and cashing them out or something. And maybe with 3 workers, now you're producing 100 burritos, right? Marginal product of that third worker is 50. Eventually, though, you get to a point, let's say you add a 4th or a 5th or a 6th worker, right? Where if you don't have any additional production space, even if more and more customers keep pouring into the store, right? By the time you hit that 7th worker, yes, with 7 workers, you could have 2 people at each stage in the process, right? But with limited space, there's only so much more you can do, right? So, maybe by the time you add that 4th worker, you're producing 120 burritos total, right? So that 4th worker added 20, which was less than the 3rd, right? You add a 5th worker, maybe you get an extra 10 or 15 in the hour, right? But again, that's less than before. So eventually, without adding any more production space, right? Without adding a second cash register and another production line, you hit a point where marginal product falls. Questions on that? So coming back to this think, pair, share at the beginning, right? The same is going to apply to talent accumulation in sport, right? Why did I give that example of Jokic going to 2 different teams, right? Well, if you're adding a talented player to a team that has very little talent, the Wizards, right? That player is going to add a lot to total output, right? You put Jokic on the Wizards, they might win 20 more games, right? Which is big. If you add a talented player to a roster with a whole bunch of other talented players, there's a limit on how much additional winning you can do, right? You add Jokic to that Thunder team, he's taking minutes away from Hartenstein and Chet, right? And maybe they win 2 more games and win 70 games instead of 68 or something, right? Questions on that? And again, this is going to apply to any production process you're looking at, right? Like I gave the example of Chipotle and talent accumulation, right? But if you're a manager in any department within a sports organization, right? If you're only adding workers to the process, but your capital is fixed, eventually you hit diminishing marginal product. That's going to happen regardless of the position, right? Questions on this? Okay, so moving on from production to costs, and there's a pretty close relationship between those 2 things. Some terms, and again, you've seen these terms before, hopefully in a principles course. Total cost is the sum of fixed and variable costs. Fixed costs are costs that do not depend on your level of output. So as you produce more units, your fixed costs stay the same. Variable costs are costs that vary with the level of output. So as you produce more units, your variable costs increase. And we're going to look at a knowledge check question and then kind of talk through an example. So I'll give you 20 more seconds if you're catching up in the slide, then we'll go to the knowledge check question. Questions so far? Okay, so going to the knowledge check question. Suppose you decide to open your own Chipotle franchise in Ann Arbor, in an Ann Arbor suburb, my apologies. Which of the following is most likely to be among your fixed costs? So A, the wages paid to your employees, B, the rent for using the building, C, electricity and other utilities costs, or D, costs of ingredients like rice, meats, veggies, tortillas, etc. So take 10 seconds to think about it and I'll ask for hands. Hands for A, hands for B, hands for C, hands for D, Yeah, so B is our correct answer here. It should be rent for using the building. And if we're looking through these four choices, right, we said fixed costs don't change based on how much you produce, variable costs do. If we look at these choices, whether you produce 50 burritos in a day or 5,000 burritos in a day, your rent for the month stays the same, right? So no matter how much you're producing in a given day, your rent is constant, right? Maybe you're paying $10,000 for the month to rent that storefront, right? Whether you're producing 50 burritos or 5,000 burritos in a day, you're still paying $10,000 in rent for the month. If you compare that to your other choices, like your wages paid to your employees, if you're producing a lot more burritos in a day, you're going to have more workers working a given shift, right? So more burritos means you need to have more hourly workers. You're going to spend more money. Right? Electricity and other utilities, right? It might depend on the type of utility, right? But if you're producing a lot more burritos, you're going to have the oven on for more time in the day than if you're producing less burritos, right? As you're trying to, cook meats, right? Or you're going to have the rice cooker turned on for more time during the day if you're producing a lot more burritos, right? So you're using more electricity and gas. Some of your utilities costs might be fixed, right? So like you're going to have the lights on in the store no matter how many customers come in, right? So that's not going to change. Cost of ingredients, rice, meats, veggies, tortillas, right? If you're producing and selling a lot more burritos, you're going to need to, procure a lot more raw materials, right? Questions on this? All right, cool. So let's come back to this question of thinking about fixed and variable costs for a sports team or venue. And I'm going to hop into Zoom, so bear with me for a second. So let's suppose that we're starting our own sports franchise. So, maybe we're considering the example of we're starting our own minor league soccer franchise here in Ann Arbor, right? The question here is, what are some fixed costs? I'm going to put fixed input / costs. And what are some variable inputs or costs? And here, if we're thinking about output, right, let's imagine that the output is, how many tickets we're selling, right? So what are the costs that are going to vary with how many tickets we are selling? And what are the costs that are going to stay the same no matter how many tickets we're selling on the season? So somebody want to volunteer a specific input or cost and tell me which side of the table we're putting it in.
Fix the rent at whatever stadium you're playing at.
Okay, yeah, so you're probably using some sort of facility, right? And whether you sell 10,000 tickets to the game or 10 tickets to the game, you're probably paying a fixed rent to use the facility space. Sure.
Player's wage.
Fixed or variable?
Sorry?
You said fixed?
Yep.
Awesome. Yep. Yeah, so salaries for players. Right, so you're probably going to have players sign contracts before the season starts, right? And those contracts are going to say, I'm going to pay you, $60,000 for the season, and that's not going to change with how many people come to attend.
Fixed coaching salaries and employees.
So do you want to be a little more, so manager salaries, I agree. Any other employees you want to put within the fixed column?
Like front office.
Yep. Yeah, so let's say manager or front office salaries generally. Yep. Anybody want to put some workers over on the variable side?
I was going to say, if a player has like an incentive or a bonus that comes with performance, that would be a variable cost.
Yeah, so you might have some like incentive-based pay for players. I don't know if this would necessarily be tied to ticket sales, but maybe. So maybe some incentive-based pay, or if the team is performing well, that might kick in some incentives that lead to more people at the stadium. Other workers you want to put on the variable side? Yeah.
I guess you could say concessions.
Yeah, so definitely like concessions workers. Any other workers you want to add to this side? So like concessions, I don't know, probably like, I don't know, like grounds and maintenance maybe, or maybe at least like janitorial workers. Probably like somebody that's like, working the gate, right? But any of these, like this, more broadly, we might describe these workers as like game day staff. Falls under variable. Other answers here?
Like utilities, like electricity, water,
Variable, yeah. Yeah, so probably a lot of our utilities might fall under variable. Again, if you have more people coming to games, there are more people using the restrooms, for example. Yeah.
Travel expenses?
Under fixed or variable?
Variable.
So whose travel expenses, I guess, are we asking?
Like the teams.
So if we're thinking about in terms of ticket sales, right, I would argue that no matter how many tickets we sell, we're still spending the same amount to get to stadiums, right? If you were thinking about, like, from the fans' perspective, more tickets would incur more travel costs, potentially. So I agree, definitely want to think about travel expenses. I'm going to throw that under fixed. In this case, whether we sell 10 tickets or 10,000 tickets, we still need to get to our road venues, potentially. Anything else you want to add to this list? Yeah, we got a pretty good list here. There are probably some utilities that fall under fixed. Like water for maintaining the fields. Right, it might fall under fixed here. So probably some utilities that falls under fixed here too. Things that we're missing. Where would the opportunity cost of me, the entrepreneur, where would the opportunity cost of my time go on this visual? So again, if we're thinking about this from the perspective of economic costs, the opportunity cost of my time is somewhere. Which side of the figure is my opportunity cost? Right, so presumably I'm quitting my job as a professor to start this franchise. Or at the very least, I'm taking some time that otherwise might have went toward my work and using that time. So fixed or variable for my opportunity costs? Hands for fixed? Hands for variable? Hands for I don't remember what opportunity cost is? Okay. I'd probably say opportunity cost falls on the fixed side. So let's say this is the entrepreneur's opportunity cost. Now, the caveat here is that we might already be considering my opportunity cost if I'm being paid a salary, right? So maybe I'm getting paid a fixed salary. Otherwise, if I'm not being paid a fixed salary, the opportunity cost of my time is fixed. No matter how many tickets we sell, I'm still putting X number of hours per week into this venture, right? Questions on this? All right, cool. So let me go back to the slides. Some more terminology here related to costs. Marginal and average costs are things you would have also seen before too. Marginal cost is your change in total cost associated with the production of an additional unit of a good. So in this case, change in total cost divided by your change in output. So this might be, what is the additional cost of selling one more ticket? Or the cost associated with having sold one more ticket. And these additional costs might come from selling additional tickets means we need additional game day workers, right? Something we didn't include in our table were things like marketing and advertising costs, right? Marketing and advertising costs might be a variable cost, right? The more tickets we sell, the more money we were putting into marketing and advertising, right? So if I want to sell one more ticket, I might need to put in some effort to sell that ticket, right? Average cost is a general term that we give to cost divided by quantity produced. So what is my per unit cost? Or how much money am I spending in cost per ticket sold? We could think about average cost in terms of average fixed, variable, or total cost. Average fixed cost is my fixed cost divided by my output. Average variable cost is variable cost over output. Average total cost is total cost over output. We're going to look at an example with graphs in a second, but we're going to work through an illustrative example first. Questions to this point? So before I show you the cost graph that you probably saw in your Principles of Econ class, I want to work through an illustrative example. And really, this is an example to illustrate the relationship between marginals and averages. So consider the case of free throw shooting. So my illustrative example here, we've got a player, her name is Megan, she plays basketball. And let's imagine that she goes to the free throw line 10 times per game. Right? I realize in practice you might get 6 free throws one day, 2 the next, 15 the next, right? But let's imagine, for purpose of illustration, Megan gets to the free throw line consistently 10 times per game. We could think about how she performs in a given game as her marginal free throw percentage, and how she's performing across the season as her average free throw percentage. So again, single game, marginal, across the season average. What we want to understand here is what is the relationship between Megan's marginal free throw percentage and her average percentage on the season. So here we have 5 games played. In the first game, Megan made 5 free throws. Game 2, she made 7. Game 3, she made 3. Game 4, 1. And game 5, she made 9. All right, so that was her performance across the 5 games. What does her average look like across the season? Well, after the first game, she made 5 of her 10 shots. Her average is 50%. After the second game, she's now made 12 total free throws out of 20. Her average is now 60%. Third game, she's now made 15 out of 30 total. Fourth game, she's made 16 out of 40, and so on. Right? What is the general pattern here? Well, if you're looking at these numbers, game 2, her marginal was above her average, and that led to an increase in her average, right? So when Megan had a good game, she did better than her prior average. That brought her average up. Games 3 and 4, her marginals are below her average. That brings her average down. All right, so again, overall relationship here, when marginal is above average, the average goes up. Marginal is below the average is going down. Questions on that? And summary of what I was just saying, but this is going to apply to costs as well. So when we look at the cost graph on the next slide, keep this general relationship in mind. So this is the typical cost graph that you would have seen in a Principles of Micro class. And what you'll see here is that anywhere that marginal cost is below average total or average variable cost, those average costs are falling. And anywhere that marginal cost is above the average cost, those average costs are rising, right? So again, marginal below the averages are falling. Marginal above the averages are rising. Average variable and average total costs have their minimum points where marginal cost is crossing those two curves. Questions on this? And again, hopefully you've seen this graph previously. Okay. A knowledge check question. I'll give you guys a couple of minutes to work on this. So knowledge check question number 2. Zhao recently started a small business where he produces timely, funny, sport-related t-shirts. Zhao spent $300 on the machine he uses to print the t-shirts. He incurs about $7 in cost for the raw materials, the t-shirt, the ink, and the energy needed to produce a single t-shirt. What is Zhao's total cost of producing 100 shirts? So again, take a minute or so to do this math, and I'll ask for hands. Again, feel free to talk with someone next to you. That's perfectly fine. All right, I'm going to bring us back together. Can I get hands for choice A? Hands for A. Hands for choice B? Hands for choice C? Hands for choice D? Yeah, so I would say C is the correct answer, right? And the quick math there, in terms of his total costs are fixed costs plus variable costs. He spent $300 on the machine, and he's spending $7 per shirt times 100 shirts, so another 700. 300 plus 700 gets us 1,000. Questions on that? A follow-up question. What is Zhao's average fixed cost of producing 100 shirts? So again, take 30 seconds to do this math here. So what is Zhao's average fixed cost of producing 100 shirts? All right, hands for choice A, hands for choice B, hands for C, hands for D. So it should be A, and just quickly talking about why it's A. Average fixed cost is our fixed cost divided by our output. In this case, our total fixed cost was $300, right? $300 fixed cost for the machine. Divide that by the number of units sold, which was 100. So 300 divided by 100 gets us at 3. And again, that was coming from the equation on this slide here. So average fixed cost is fixed cost divided by quantity. Take that 300, divide by 3. Sorry, take that 300, divide by 100 to get 3. Questions on that? Okay. All right, cool. Let's talk about revenues. So we said before, revenue is the term given to the amount of money collected by firms for the sale of products. So you sell your product, how much money are you taking in? If we've got a simple example where the firm is selling a single type of product and they're charging a single price for that product, right? So let's imagine that I am selling pizza. I sell one type of pizza. I just sell large cheese pizzas, and I charge $10 per pizza. If I sell 50 pizzas, my revenue is 50 pizzas times $10, 500, right? So in the very simple case where I've got a single price that I charge and I've got one type of unit I'm selling, my revenue is price times quantity. Certainly, in reality, figuring out revenue is a little bit more complicated. You probably sell a whole bunch of different products and might charge several different prices, right? But the idea is the same, right? Revenue for the firm is going to be how many units they're selling times what price they're charging. Add that up across all different types of units they're selling. Marginal revenue, marginal is always a change. That's our change in total revenue when the firm sells one more unit. So how much additional money am I making when I sell one more unit of a good? And then average revenue is my per unit revenue. That's my total revenue divided by output. And again, marginal is always a change. Average is always per unit. Questions so far on these terms? So a knowledge check question. This is the same setup as before. If Zhao sells each shirt for $20, what is his total revenue from selling 100 shirts? Hands for choice A, hands for choice B, hands for choice C, hands for choice D. Yeah, so should be C, right? So his revenue in this case is how many units he's selling times the price for each unit, right? So in this case, he's selling 100 shirts at $20 each. His revenue is 100 times 20, which is 2,000. Questions on that? All right, cool. So profits. We talked about revenue, we talked about costs. Now let's talk about profits here. Profits are found by subtracting costs from revenues. So mathematically, profit is total revenue minus total costs. Firms look to maximize their profits, and they're going to do so by selling output up to the point where marginal revenue and marginal costs are equal. We're going to look at that in more detail next class when we talk about different market structures. But general rule is maximize profits where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. And the logic here is that if we're producing too little and our marginal cost is low, we're producing too much, our marginal cost is high. When our marginal revenue is above our marginal cost, that means the additional money we could make from selling exceeds our additional cost incurred by producing. We should sell more, right? So if my marginal cost for producing the next shirt is only $5, but I'm selling it for $20, if I produce one more shirt, I'm making $15 in extra profit, right? My marginal profit is 15. Right, so if my marginal cost is low and my marginal revenue is high, I should produce more. Right? Alternatively, if my marginal revenue is less than my marginal cost, if on my last unit, it cost me $30 to make that shirt, but I'm only selling it for $20, right? I lost $10 on that unit, right? So again, in that case, if my marginal revenue does not exceed my marginal cost, right, I'm losing money on that unit, I should produce less. So generally speaking, marginal revenue better than marginal costs is bad because I could make more money by producing more. Marginal revenue less than marginal costs, also bad because I'm losing money by producing too much. Questions? Another knowledge check question here. So same setup. If Zhao sells each shirt for $20, what is his profit from selling 100 shirts? Again, take a minute to answer this question. All right, hands for choice A, hands for choice B, hands for choice C, and hands for choice D. Yeah, so it should be C, great. And your reasoning for choice C, profit is revenues minus costs. We had said our revenue from selling 100 shirts at $20 each was 20 times 100. Our revenue was $2,000, right? Our costs from producing those 100 shirts, right? We had $300 in fixed costs. We had 7 times 100 or $700 in variable costs. Our costs are 1,000, right? So profit is revenue minus costs. Profit is 2,000 minus 1,000 is 1,000. Questions on that? Okay. So I want to talk a little bit about revenue and cost specifically within the sport context, now that we've talked about it more generally. So what are some examples of variable and fixed costs in a sport setting? Our primary variable cost is costs associated with our game day staff, right? If we're selling more tickets, we are hiring more concessions workers, we are hiring more ticketing attendants, we are hiring more janitorial staff, etc. In terms of our fixed costs, playing talent is a significant fixed cost, but that varies by league. In the context of our professional men's leagues in the US, playing talent gets about 50% of revenues. So about 50% of our costs is going toward playing talent in the NFL, the NBA, the NHL, and Major League Baseball. A little bit of variation by league, but about 50% of the money coming in is going to players. That number is far lower in the WNBA, which is going to lead to significant labor conflict in the coming months, right? In the NBA, they say that number is 20%. That's about 5 years old, right? The current number in the WNBA is like 4% or something, right? Again, compare that to 50% in the NBA. In the UFC, fighters get about 20% of revenues also. Higher than 50% in like English Premier League or some of these open leagues over in Europe. Now, before this year, only about 5% of revenues went to athletes in the NCAA, right? And that 5% going to athletes was in the form of scholarships, right? So your scholarship plus your room and board, your cost of attendance, right, accounted for about 5% of revenues going to athletes previously, or about 5% of, 5% of all expenditures by university athletics departments went to athletes before. Now that number's a lot higher, potentially, right? We don't actually know what the real numbers are, but it could be, NCAA member institutions can now spend up to $20.5 million this year on playing talent, right? Depending on what school you're at, $20.5 million is like 10% for Michigan or even less, right? $20.5 million might be 80% for Rutgers or pick some other smaller D1 school. Questions? Okay. We also have costs for coaching. Coaching also represents a significant fixed cost. In our major men's leagues, coaches are not paid a huge share of revenues. You're talking like 1 to 3% in the NFL or the NBA, though that number is rising a bit. NBA coaching salaries have gone up a bit, right? But still, like the highest paid coach in the NBA is paid way less than Steph Curry, right? Highest paid coach is maybe making like 17 million or something right now in the NBA. Steph is making close to 60, right? In NCAA, D1, power conference football and basketball, coaches are making a lot more money, right? And we're going to see this graph later on in the course, right? But like the top paid public employee in like half states in the U.S. Is either a head football coach or a head basketball coach at one of our public schools, right? So lots of money going to coaches in the NCAA, though maybe that'll change. Stadiums and venues represent a fixed cost. If you're paying some sort of rent for the facility, like Michigan Athletics pays rent back to the university or something to use the facility, right? So those are fixed costs. Operating expenses, like expenses for referees, travel, equipment, that's all fixed. Front office costs, sales, marketing, administration, all that generally fixed. Questions on this? Okay. In terms of where is the money coming from or what are our revenue sources, the biggest source of revenue for major professional and college sports in the US is media. Typically coming from your national broadcasting agreements, though in some leagues, regional broadcasting agreements are more important, though our regional sports networks are dying in the US. So a lot of that is your national TV deals. That's 30 to 60% of revenues, depending on your league. Game day revenue sources, coming from tickets, concessions, parking, and premium seating, that's about 15 to 30%, more in some leagues than in others. And then pretty much the rest of your revenue is coming from sponsorship, either advertising or merchandise. Questions around those revenue sources? Okay. Looking at gate revenues, so this is your money coming from like ticket sales and concessions and such. Depending on the league, there's significant variation in some leagues across the teams, and other leagues there's not. So if you want to look at this graph, this is for each of the 4 major men's leagues in the US. Gate revenues for the year sorted from highest to lowest, right? So like Major League Baseball, top team in terms of like ticket sales and concessions would be the Yankees. That's that top dot there. They made, in this specific graph, this is probably 2018 or 19, the Yankees made almost $260 million from tickets and concessions, right? The lowest dot here, probably like, I don't know, your Miami Marlins or something, right? They made only like $25 million on the season in gate revenues, right? In Major League Baseball, there's pretty significant variation. If you look at like the NFL is like the most balanced of the leagues there, right? Your highest gate revenue team made about $100 million. Your lowest gate revenue team made like almost $40 million, right? Why is the highest team in the NFL making a lot less than the highest team in Major League Baseball? Yeah?
There's a lot less games.
Yeah, so it's not that Major League Baseball is doing better per game, right? But Major League Baseball, you've got like 81 home games versus 8 or 9 home games in the NFL, right? Even still, the worst of the NFL teams is making more money than the Miami Marlins in their 9 games versus the Marlins 81 games. Questions on this figure? In terms of our broadcast deals, and some of this figure is a little bit out of date here, you can see the total broadcasting rights deal for the league, and this is in millions, and then you can see per team. The NFL's deal here is current. So the NFL gets $10 billion per year in broadcasting revenues from all the networks that are part of this deal. So NFL is getting $10 billion per year. That means each team is taking in $312.5 million per year from that agreement. And those revenues are split evenly across the teams. The NBA, this number, well, is present through 25. The new deal for the NBA, the number is significantly larger. Like the new NBA deal is like 11 year, 75 million. I want to say it's closer to like 7 billion per year. Right, so 11 year, 75 billion. Right, so about 7 billion per year for the NBA currently. Which, increases that number like by a factor of 3 or something, right? The other one in this figure that is out of Major League Soccer, that deal is old. The new Major League Soccer agreement's more like 250 million per year. So a better number than that 90, but still small compared to these other leagues. Questions on this? But you can see like this is pretty significant money, coming into the teams from these agreements. Right, so like for the NFL, the top team in terms of gate revenues was like 100 million. Every team is getting 312 million from the TV deal. Questions? Cool. For comparison, we can see soccer over in Europe across the different leagues. So it's certainly the case that over in Europe, the number one source of revenue are these broadcast deals, right? Which is also true here in the US. So like English Premier League, of their $5.8 billion in revenues, 3.4 billion is coming from the broadcast deal, and those are in euros. You can see some other big sources here. So like sponsorship is number 2 for each of these leagues. The game day revenues are actually a bit lower compared to North American sports. Questions on this? I'm not going to walk you through every number in that table. In terms of stadium naming rights, that is a significant source of revenue for teams that own their own arenas. And you can see you can make a pretty decent amount of money from selling naming rights to these arenas. The deal for Crypto.com arena, which is where the Lakers, Kings, and Sparks play, the Clippers have moved, right? Crypto.com is paying $35 million per year over a 20-year term to have the naming right to that facility. But again, some pretty big ones across the board here, right? SoFi Stadium, that's a little over 30. Scotiabank, over 30, right? So again, if you own your own facility, you're taking in that sponsorship money for those naming rights. Again, a pretty big source of revenues. Questions on that? Comments on that? And like with all the Kawhi stuff that's happening right now, right? One of the pieces of information that came out, in all of this was that, the fraudulent company that paid Kawhi all this money, right? They had also offered a ton of money to Steve Ballmer to try to name the Clippers facility, right? Almost twice the deal they actually took, right? So that would have been number 1 on our list if it were up to date and they actually accepted the money from Allegiant. Any questions on this? Okay. And then the last thing I want to make note of here is revenue sharing, right? We talked about revenue sharing within the context of competitive balance last week, right? In terms of revenue sharing as a source of revenue, if you're one of the low revenue teams in the league, that shared revenue is a pretty significant source of your revenues, right? If you're one of the high revenue teams, you're losing money on revenue sharing, right? But certainly revenue sharing is super common. Revenues are shared, right? Helps to promote league stability, limits disparities, helps with competitive balance potentially. These league-wide revenue sources, like media deals, are typically split evenly. Even though the Lakers have more home games that are televised or have more games televised on national TV, the Lakers only get 1/30th of the NBA's TV agreement, right? Gate revenues are shared in leagues also. NFL, it's a 60-40 home-away split. So if you're one of those low revenue teams, you're probably a net positive on that revenue sharing. Questions on this? So again, how much revenue sharing comes into play? On average, it's 0. For some teams, shared revenue is a huge source of revenue.